Let's get started. So thanks everyone for coming. We have a very exciting speaker today, Professor Adam Yala. Before we introduce Professor Adam, I just want to give a little brief intro to the AI Precision Health Institute Affinity Group, where we hear from leaders in the field, discuss trends in AI for healthcare, bring together an interdisciplinary group of researchers who are technical, clinicians, and advocates, and where our overall goal is to foster collaborative interactions to solve problems in cancer. The rough format of these talks is about a 30 to 40 minute research talk at the beginning, followed by an interactive Q&A session / methods discussion. We want to highlight methods here that are really innovative and that could be used for healthcare, and therefore we invite speakers who are really at the cutting edge of new AI methods for healthcare, which our speaker today certainly is. If you have feedback or suggestions for speakers, please email them to either John Shepard or myself. We have a very exciting list and a diverse array of speakers coming up next year. But we are looking to schedule beyond May, so definitely send us some suggestions. The University of Hawaii is an excellent place to center discussions on AI for cancer research. The University of Hawaii has a world-class cancer research center in beautiful Kaka'aka, which you can see here. The AI Precision Health Institute is part of the Shepherd Research Lab, working on advancing the assessment of human health through technology, and the AI PHI hosts this affinity group meeting. We also have the Hawaii Data Science Institute, which is a University of Hawaii system-wide effort to support data science, collaborative research, and partnerships with industry. I'm trying to get a paper of the month going, and this month's paper is by our speaker today, using reinforcement learning for breast cancer screening policies, pretty interesting methods here, and notably published in Nature Medicine. So I think based on the abstract of the talk, we will hear about this today. An important note about speaker compensation. I don't know, John, do you have?
Yeah, so, everybody goes to too many Zoom talks, so we wanted to compensate our speakers with something that they would really respond to, and our compensation just came in. This is in my office. It's our 20-ounce AI PHI beer stein. So you'll be receiving this in the mail, Adam, and of course we'd appreciate a picture with you with the stein for our wall of honor, and however you want to do it. So,
okay,
so yeah,
fantastic.
this is our compensation package. So thank you very much for being with us today and telling us about your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to trying this slide. It's gonna be a good time.
Definitely. Is there any questions or anything else I missed? Okay. Well, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Professor Adam Yala is an assistant professor in computational precision health and electrical engineering and computer science at both UC Berkeley and UCSF. His research focuses on developing machine learning methods for personalized medicine and then translating those methods to clinical care. His previous research, which he'll talk about today, has contributed to 3 areas. 1 is predicting future cancer risk. 2 is designing personalized screening policies, like in that Nature Medicine paper. And 3 is private data sharing through neural obfuscation. Adam's tools have been featured in venues such as Washington Post, New York Times, Boston Globe, and Wired. Professor Yala obtained his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in computer science from MIT. We're all very excited to have you, Adam, and I guess without further ado, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can everybody see this? Cool. Okay. Thank you again. I'm very excited to be here. I'm also excited to come visit and be in Hawaii in person later this summer. But to kick things off on the research side, so the kind of key observation and motivation driving a lot of my research is improving early detection in cancer. So the motivation here in breast cancer and lung cancer are kind of obvious. We have multiple screening trials showing the improvement in outcomes. And for many cases where we have someone caught with later stage disease, the question we ask ourselves, both can we make better treatments for later stage disease, is also how can we have caught it earlier? How can we make treatment policy to systemically catch cancer at its earliest, most treatable states, both in terms of reducing morbidities, and improving overall outcomes? So in this talk, I'm going to propose to you a very simple two-step plan of how we can do this. If you want to catch cancer systemically earlier, first, before someone has cancer, we need to understand, well, who is likely to get it in the near future? We need to get a sense of foresight looking into the future. And second, given this information, which will always be imperfect, we need to devise policy to do something about it. We need to change the screening workflow accordingly to actually use these tools to do better interventions. So let's talk about each of these problems in turn, to kind of technical components of both. The first being predicting cancer risk. So this is a very common problem, and I really emphasize that the formulation here is not looking at the picture on the right and identifying, the cancer is here, but instead looking at the picture on the left and identifying which patients are likely to develop cancer in the near future. And this has been a really core focus of ours, especially when I was at MIT throughout my PhD, with the recent papers shown here, including the one in JCO. So to kind of step back and look at this problem formulation, I want to emphasize this is in no way a new problem, right? For a long time, people thought about this, and the traditional formulation is that we're going to look at all of our expert knowledge that we know about the disease, right? We know age is really important. We know family history is a really core factor. Things like prior breast procedures. And we've also done a lot of work as a community, understanding that imaging has lots to tell us about breast cancer risk. And traditional approach of doing so really relies on first conceptualizing what of this information matters as experts, and then plugging in this model, this information into a relatively simple model, like a log linear model, source to understand risk. Now, the key limitation of this approach, despite it being kind of the foundation of where we are today, is that we can lose a lot of information in this summary. For example, breast density in traditional form, there's like millions of pixels in the mammogram, reducing the first 4 categories, and plugging in the SIN gives us a relatively modest bump in overall accuracy. So the normal measure here is often 5-year AUC. For those who are not familiar, it's like, 50 is random, 100 is perfect. And the lots of kind of current clinical state-of-the-art models hover around the low 60 range across like population-wide screening. So the first key departure we took, and the first kind of key idea here, well, what more, if we instead treat this as a full learning problem and don't pre-summarize the information, what more can we learn? So the paradigm here can be very simple. We have longitudinal retrospective screening data. In this case, it was over 50,000 patients, 200,000 exams for MGH. That's a hospital system in Boston. And for each patient, like let's say the one hypothetically in blue, green, and orange, we know the future outcome. One got diagnosed in 3 years, one had no cancer within 5 years of follow-up, the other one had cancer in 5 years. Now, our learning task is just to, given this information, let's learn the correct pattern. Right? Conceptually, if density is all we could do, we would learn density, but maybe there's more flexible information in it that can better drive our understanding of cancer risk. And this is a kind of key learning task. Now, there's multiple key ideas to make this work in practice, but I want to briefly walk through the results first to kind of motivate why this kind of method is important and what it can enable clinically. So to start off, I'm going to just first show you the results. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the 5-year AUCs on the MGH test set. So this is held out patients, roughly like 5,000 patients total, compared to the Todd-Cusick model. So the Todd-Cusick model, is not familiar, is kind of like the epitome of the classical risk model in my eyes. It has like a huge amount of questions, both in covering breast density, imaging factors. You have whether someone took hormone replacement therapy, menopause status, super detailed family history, and all this kind of like classic expert knowledge we know about this disease system. And all of that together only gets you a 5-year AUC in this test set of roughly 62, which is well around the rest of the literature and the previous slide that I showed you. Now, here, Mirai, our deep learning model, shown here using, but this is using the image alone, gets you 76. And it's not enough to kind of see it on one test set. Maybe it's a fluke, maybe there's a bias in the data. And so we worked really hard and did a lot of international travel to validate this model across all these different places all over the world, including Barretos in Brazil, Ching Memorial, Taiwan, Karolinska in Sweden, and other places across the United States and Mexico. And across all of these different settings, here I'm showing the validation sets in the JCO paper. We found the model gets roughly the same or better performance in these different settings. So one thing you might, so kind of takeaway here is we can get a substantial boost in performance by just looking at the image alone. And all of these settings outside of MGH, there actually is no clinical risk factor collection. Okay, so that's the first piece. A reasonable question you might be asking is, okay, so what? There's a better AUC. why does anyone care, right? And AUC by itself does not imply an improvement in care. So there's many workflows we can consider here. The first one is one that's actually, when I have a small study funded by BCRF to explore a collaboration with UMass, is better selecting patients for supplemental screening. So I mentioned before, we want to change the screening workflow, given this information to get better early detection. A common workflow to do so is via high-risk screening programs with things like MRI. So the idea is if you have someone that's currently negative mammogram but of high risk, maybe a cancer might be caught in a few years and a mammogram could be caught today at an MRI. So this really large investments into high-risk screening programs with MR. And if you look at the eligibility criteria for each care, well, how many people are going to develop cancer in the near future are actually flagged by our risk screening program. So compared to the current existing guidelines, namely tachysic lifetime risk, we find for the exact same screening volume, you should be able to get a roughly like 70% increase in cancer yield. And when they disagree, when you say you're low risk by one but high risk by the other, you have this essential boost in prevalence when you look at the disagreements of MIRI high but tachysic low. So kind of one obvious use case is just plug and play. Can we just get a big qualitative improvements on current high risk screening programs? But there's also a plethora of other kinds of interventions we can consider. So one intervention that was early considered by MGH and Kaiser Permanente in Northern California is actually running a very similar study now, is prioritizing screening from the backlog. So as many of you know, during COVID, lots of screening totally froze. And there's a kind of large backlog of patients that have not been able to get screened since the shutdowns of the pandemic and restrictions of capacity. And when we think about, as we open up the system and kind of bring people back in, the immediate workflow that our colleagues at MGH proposed and explored was prioritizing who to call back and the scheduling by highest risk today, given the prior imaging. And now very similar studies are being pursued. Now I want to note that like the correct use case of how you use a risk model and the kind of workflows you can imagine will clearly differ by clinical setting. And so we're working very hard to recruit parties from all over the world as part of this kind of Wellcome Trust MIT Clinical Trial Network to explore what are ways to best leverage technologies in different clinical settings with partners from Nigeria, Brazil, as well as Kaiser Permanente to understand the broad ways you can imagine designing risk-adjusted screening programs. Now, this is on the use cases side, and I hope I've made some motivation of why these models are interesting. Let's dive into, well, technically, what is this model doing and what are some ideas that are relevant? So at a very high level, MIRI is a image-based risk model that takes in the 4 standard views of patient's mammogram. I say patient in blue. We have the regular screening mammogram. So you have left, right, CC, MLO. Those are 2 different images. But we're going to feed all 4 images into a deep learning model to predict risk across multiple time points. So here it's formulated predicting a risk curve. So you're predicting probability of cancer within 1 year, within 2, within 3, within 4, within 5. And you see here it's like monotonic because it's cumulative. So there are multiple, so again, at a very high level, it's just learning and mapping from this to the outcomes. But there's a couple of key challenges we had to resolve to make this actually work. The first challenge being device invariance. So this is very surprising when we ran into this. I didn't expect this. But when we first built the models in MGH data, and I was working on a version 1 of clinical implementation, found this weird issue in which the model predicts something systemically different depending on which machine the image was taken on. So here, I'm just showing you, actually, this is a t-SNE, so 2D plot of the 5D risk vector. So this is actually risk predictions colored by the acquiring machine. And you see that there's like very clearly separable different behaviors depending on the generation of a logic machine used to acquire the image, which personally blew my mind because there's like visibly they look very similar. There's no clear shift. The incidence was the same between them, but the model still learned a different behavior between them. And this is also clearly clinically nonsense, right? You never want to say like you qualified more for higher screening because you happen to take this machine. So the first challenge in making this ready was, well, how do we make it actually consistent across the different machines? So once we looked at the bias, well, the kind of immediate idea is, well, can we train to eliminate it because we can measure it directly? So we're going to do this via a conditional adversarial training scheme. So what I mean by that is going to take the model that kind of takes all the images, we're going to break it up into a couple components. There's the encoder that maps the images to representation. There's a predictor that takes in that vector to risk over time. And we're going to introduce a discriminator that gets to look at these representations and wants to predict which device data came from. And we're going to reformulate our objective in order to both work to eliminate the bias, meaning minimize actually the discriminator while learning the risk function. And by doing this, we actually found that we can completely eliminate the device bias. Another way to view this, if you look at this, the accuracy of the classifier before and after. Before, our device AUC by just looking at the risk prediction had an AUC of like 77. After doing this, it goes down to 50, showing that the bias within the representation was fully eliminated. That's kind of one key piece that we had to resolve to make it work. The other piece was, how do we actually leverage missing risk factor information? So as I mentioned earlier at the start of the talk, we know lots about breast cancer, right? We know lots of classical risk factors that have been curated for a very long period of time. And it captures a lot of information. It's available in some settings like MGH, but not available in many others. So one of the key tasks we wanted to resolve was, well, how can we benefit this information at training time and use it if it's there without requiring it at test time? Because we want to have one model that can support the broad variety of resource environments. And the way we thought about this was via conditional imputation. And what I mean by that is we're going to look from the image, we're actually going to train to predict all the risk factors. And if that information is not available, then we use the predicted versions. So what that means is, like, from the given mammogram, predicting what is the expected average age, the expected family history, et cetera. And what we found here was actually quite interesting. Lots of the known risk factors like age, number of children, menopause status are actually very strongly predictable from the mammogram, and relatively few are not very easy to predict, like family history and BRCA status. And for that, it kind of gives you the conditional average given that population. And so what that lets you do, though, is that, like, now we can kind of take one model and seamlessly integrate in these different settings. The additional objective, which acts as a regularizer, slightly improves generalization and gives us this larger flexibility. Finally, the kind of last piece of this model I want to discuss is the very way we formulate risk prediction in itself. So fundamentally, we were trying to predict the risk across multiple time points. And there's a question of, well, how do you actually encode this into the learning problem? One classical way for familiar survival modeling is you say risk is a proportional thing over time. We have an overall hazard curve. We're going to learn a proportional shift over that. The issue with this kind of proportional hazard formulation, which is the most common in literature, is that it assumes the features that matter is the same across all time points. But when we look at imaging, we know that the feature of cancer within a year, which is like detection, is very different than the feature of cancer within 5 years. Right? There's different patterns that we're looking to learn. And so the key idea is, let's give the model the flexibility to do so by kind of having a separate little component to predict that marginal hazard within 1 to 2 years and 2 to 3 years, et cetera. And so our model has these different components to predict the curve, and we just, given what amount of data is observed, we train that relative part of the curve. And so now we can deal with variable amounts of follow-up in a seamless way, while also maintaining the flexibility to learn that the different features matter for different components. And kind of all of these improvements together give you the overall performance and this generalization and gap. Now, one thing I want to note here is that this is not a uniquely breast cancer picture, right? So we actually have very similar work in lung cancer that is now in press at JCO, which will be public one day. These things take forever, but this is a common experience. We're really excited about. And there, the classical model, once again, is expert information. So the PLCO model looks at smoking history, age, and other things, number of pack years. The imaging model here looks at low-dose CT. And we can still get a large substantial improvement in performance by looking directly, like basically to cover what unknown information exists in there. And something that's interesting that we've been exploring in the case of lung cancer is twofold. One of them is in the development of key preventative measures. So in breast cancer, we sometimes, if we have approved guidelines, would take things like tamoxifen to lower the risk of cancer. If you're trying to develop a new therapy of that kind, let's say in the context of lung cancer, you need to have high-risk cohorts to even run clinical trials. So one use case we've been looking at is compared to even high, like intuitively high-risk patients, meaning like high smoking history, we can still identify much more enriched cancer cohorts for clinical trial design. Something we've been discussing with different pharma colleagues. And the other thing that's been quite interesting is that when the model is confident someone's high risk, even if there is no nodule, the model can actually identify the location of the cancer 5 years in the future with non-trivial accuracy. So here you see like a random is 50 and 83 is roughly the accuracy here, which is really interesting because maybe there are opportunity, even though risk is a complex phenomenon, if there are opportunities for more localized preventative intervention, if you can have a gauge of where the cancer is likely to develop given the patient context, I think is super interesting. Okay, so this is kind of the first piece of the talk, which is how can we better understand cancer risk, which is just like one piece of the puzzle. And I showed you some kinds of interventions it enables, right? But I really want to think about, well, if we have better risk models, clearly we should be able to make better screening guidelines, right? Like we really want to what are ways to kind of rethink this kind of policy design side of the question to better translate this to impact. And this is going to be the focus of the second half of the talk. And this is the focus of our recent Nature Medicine paper. So to set the stage, let's talk a little bit about how screening works today. So I have very different patients, shown here hypothetically again in blue, green, and orange. They all have different mammograms, and as you might imagine, different risk profiles. And our screening guidelines, while we have many of them that all disagree, per guideline tend to say for everyone do the same thing, right? Let's say you get screened every single year. And the issue with this is that for the exact same screening regime, you can have very different outcomes, right? The patient in blue could have had a later stage diagnosis by year 2, indicating that maybe a more sensitive screening regime would have been helpful. The patient in green could have had nothing at all and simply unnecessary hassles and anxiety. And the patient in orange could have had unnecessary biopsies and substantial harm through the screening process with no actual benefit. And this kind of highlights the simultaneous challenges facing screening today. On one hand, there's large calls to action of how do we improve early detection. Late detection contributes to poor outcomes. How do we better serve patients that are currently being treated with late-stage disease? And how do we prevent them happening in the future? It's a very real, meaningful call to action. At the same time, there's a separate, also really justified movement of reducing overscreening and the harms associated with screening of all the unneeded biopsies and the kind of harms associated with that. And at the same time, because different populations have different kind of etiology of when cancer likely to develop, one-size-fits-all guidelines often contribute to known health disparities. So to resolve all 3 of these problems, meaning better early detection, less overscreening, and less disparities, we have this kind of broader goal of tailoring the screening regime to individual patient need. So this is going to be a very simple proof of concept. We're going to focus primarily on mammography frequency. There's more to screening than that, but this is going to be where we're going to start off. And the hypothetical scenario we want to get to is if someone's going to be diagnosed with later-stage disease, let's say at year 2, we want to have, for them, offer them a more sensitive screening regime, because for them, the cost benefit will more likely be worth it. And for other patients of lower risk, we want to give them a less sensitive screening regime that's better tailored to their individual needs. All right, so this is the overall goal we're trying to get to. Now let's talk about how we're going to formulate this as a learning problem. So the key setup here is we're going to formulate the problem of policy design as a learning task. And so given a patient, in their imaging, we're going to extract some features. And here I wrote down we're going to get the risk. I wrote down as a single scale, but in reality, it's like in the paper, it's the 5-dimensional vector of the risk. We can imagine having any amount of features and kind of covariates in that vector. And from this vector, we want to predict when should the patient come back for the next imaging. In general, you can imagine multiple modalities, but just for the sake of this, we're going to say just when you come back for the next mammogram. And the objective of this model is to maximize the reward. There's going to be some weighted combination of expected early detection benefit while minimizing screening costs. This is the overall setup. Now, the key idea here is we can actually learn this function and measure this notion of benefit and cost by simulating counterfactual patient trajectories. So let's talk about what that means. We have longitudinal patient data, right? We know how people were screened. And so look at the example again of patient in blue. They were screened at year 0, year 1, and diagnosed in year 2. Given this reference frame of what happened to this patient in hindsight, it is not too crazy to imagine what we would rather have happened for that patient with the power of hindsight. So let's imagine we have a counterfactual policy, here shown as a tempo policy in blue. They recommend they get screened every 6 months instead. Given the power of hindsight, we can simulate, well, for this person, we expect the cost of this counterfactual rollout to be here worked down as 4 screens, but we don't have a cost model to say for a given simulated person in hindsight, here's what we expect the cost to be, here's what we expect the benefit to be. Now we have many options, both a cost model and a benefit model. We're going to do something very simple here. We're going to say cost is number of screening. So it's going to be screening volume should be roughly proportional to risk of unnecessary biopsy. And for screening benefit, this is a bit more tricky. The ideal thing we want to get to is something that says, well, delta in quality of life year, given the actual cancer state. We're going to take a simplified assumption here to say that for a given cancer, there's going to be a maximum amount of possible benefit. Here we wrote as maybe 18 months, but we tried different assumptions. And we're going to say basically we're going to simulate a fixed possible early detection benefit. But conceptually, this is really plug and play. So you're going to put in an arbitrary fancy benefit model and cost model. But the broad idea is for individual patients, we can roll out counterfactuals, plug in our best models of counterfactual benefit and cost. We can do patients that develop cancer, and here we see expected cost of 4 and benefit of 6. We can do for patients that don't develop cancer, so here you have a cost of 2 and benefit of 0. And we can roll this out across our entire retrospective population. And then we can optimize our screening policies at the population level. So this is the overall kind of setup, right? We're going to roll out individual trajectories. Hindsight is a really powerful notion, and then we're going to use this across entire populations to learn better screening policies. Now, in doing so, there's 2 immediate challenges, even in simplified settings. One is, how do you actually do this rollout? So I kind of glanced over this in the original slide. You see here you have initial screening at year 0. They get recommended to come back in 6 months. What happens next? Right? What would be the next follow-up recommendation to complete the simulation? So it turns out this is not always going to hold, but it holds for particular risk models, including MIRI and things like TIRE-QSIC and others. That these models have actually a very smooth risk progression over time. So if I know the multiple risk assessments over time, it's actually quite straightforward to learn a very accurate model of the missing risk assessments along the way. We can use this to infill our observation and then get back to full rollouts. And this is because the risk is changing here very smoothly over time. So this is one component. Once you have this, we can now do full simulation rollouts and kind of get back to what would you recommended. So now that we have this kind of simulation environment, we kind of play out arbitrary policies and evaluate them and use that for training. The next two challenges, well, how do you actually learn a policy given this environment? If you have good rewards, you can imagine you viewing policy design as imitation. So with the power of hindsight, it's easy to say what's the optimal policy for this person as best as possible, right? You can say, well, you get diagnosed with this time, give my reward formulation, come back exactly at the point of maximum early detection, and skip all the negative screens in between, right? That's the optimal oracle decision. So you could view the problem of policy design as just trying to copy that oracle, right? You say, I know the target, learn me to predict that for my risk assessment, and my reward here is just the delta between the prediction and the target. It turns out this is actually a terrible way to learn. This does not work at all. And to give some intuition on why is that this is the optimal policy in general. It's not optimal for your risk model, right? If you had a perfect risk model and perfect foresight, maybe this would work and this would be achievable. But in practice, you really want to have an objective that's tied to what your risk model can actually support. And trying to predict the oracle best possible outcome in general is not tied to what's possible for your risk model. So it makes you collapse to something that's poorly correlated to what your risk model can actually do, and actually gives you very poor behavior. So the key insight here is that we actually want to formulate our learning as, for my policy, give me the best possible actions, given what I can learn from my risk assessments. So instead, we're going to treat this as a reinforcement learning problem. And what I mean by that is, instead of trying to predict what's optimal in general, given my risk and a potential action, predicting my expected cost and benefit for this action, which is a fundamentally much more well-aligned task, because you're not predicting what's optimal in general for arbitrary risk policies, you're trying to predict how well you are behaving. And so this is a common reinforcement formulation, and we're going to do this with kind of mix of benefit and cost. So the kind of prediction formulation is you have a risk, you have a potential action, let's say come back in half a year, and now you're predicting your value, which is kind of weighted combination of benefit and cost. Now, there's some immediate challenge here is that, I'm writing here that there's an inherent weighted combination of benefit and cost. And there's a choice of trade-off here, right? Like, how do you kind of weigh these different factors? And I will argue that the person to choose the trade-off is for sure not me, right? Like, there's many possible things. People disagree, different institutions, different countries disagree in how they set their guidelines. And so the true trade-off at test time, like the way we want to balance these factors, is not known to us as algorithm designers. And so we want to support all possible trade-offs at the same time. But we do know through the simulation, we can directly measure the benefit and cost. So the key idea of how we're going to do this then is that we're going to reformulate our policy a little bit to say we're going to take an input as a risk. We're going to put in a preference across those trade-offs as a vector. This is how we're going to weight these things. And given that, we want to predict what is then the optimal follow-up recommendation and then predict these values. Small reward as a vector, we're going to be training then across these different possible factors to maximize that overall reward. So all of that together gives us the overall tempo formulation. To kind of summarize, the key bits are similar counterfactual trajectories, and I'll learn a policy to support all possible preferences and kind of learn the Pareto optimal curve. Now that we kind of talked about the key method, let's go into a little bit of like, okay, what is experimental settings, what do these numbers look like, and how do these things behave? So these models are trained with the same MGH training set. This is now still 50,000 patients, but looked across roughly a 10-year period. We're going to evaluate in all the different test sets we had longitudinal data for. So this is MGH, Emory, Karolinska, and GMH. Now we can look at both the metrics, early detection and anticipated screening cost. With the soft, we can look at just efficiency. So like, what's the bang for your buck overall comparison for one choice of preference? So to kind of jump into the results a little bit, So these are the results in MGH, but numbers are very similar and qualitatively the same for different assumptions and different test sets. You see that following annual screening will give you full adherence to that, will give you some boost in early detection. So here you see it's at 1.6 months. If you actually do this kind of learn the oracle and try to copy the optimal answer in general, you actually do worse and more personalization because it collapses to really bad behavior. And if you do this kind of learn predictive value, improved efficiency here, it's 4.3 compared to 1.6. Now, it's more interesting to look at it as where you are in the trade-off curve, because I mentioned we're supporting all possible preferences. So here I'm showing you on the x-axis, mammography volume per year. So 0.5 is biannual, 1 is annual, et cetera. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the simulated early detection benefit. And you can see here, if you want to match the expected benefit of annual screening, you can just kind of go to the right. We can kind of take that point in the y-axis and go to the right, and you can roughly do so with 25% less screening by personalizing the screening regime. If you want to use on average annual screening of volume, you will get an extra roughly 4 months of benefit. And regardless of kind of where you want to be on this either early detection benefit or screening cost trade-off, you should be able to do better. You can just kind of pick the appropriate operating point by personalizing screening. And the better we make, the better the risk model. And there's actually a similar curve here for if you look at for Tyre-Cusick-based screening. But basically, the better the risk model, the more this curve moves up and to the right, giving you better selections across all possible trade-offs. Now, one thing that's interesting to understand is, well, how do these policies actually behave and how do they achieve these performances? So this is for, once again, a single point of preference. So obviously age-based gives you, so I'm showing here just histograms of recommended screenings to understand the different frequencies assigned to different patients. So biannual just switches between biannual and annual, age-based switches between biannual and annual. So this is just 2 bars there, right? Annual, biannual just have 1 bar reflecting just a single type of screening regime. Supervised MIRI, which is that predicts the oracle. You can see here it heavily biases to say either come back super frequently every 6 months or super infrequently, and doesn't use the middle range very much because that's what the oracle looks like. It says either come back far away or come back now and nothing in between. And this is why it behaves really poorly because the risk model simply isn't good enough to facilitate this. In contrast, if you look at the temporal MIRI policy, there's kind of a much smoother gradation across the slew of different actions. And it more fully utilizes the range of the kind of continuing possible recommendations. Now, one thing I think is a cool aspect of this kind of formulation is that by having this kind of test time adaptability to different clinical requirements, it also gives us a broad mechanism that we use in talking about prospective deployments and running new prospective studies. So this is something we're in conversation with multiple parties. And the broader workflow we have here, we take these policies, we look at that center's own retrospective data, we simulate out what would have happened. We can then review that, choose a desired operating point to get this kind of best, and we can plug in different reward models at test time to see for this preference, what gives us the best clinically meaningful cost benefit. And that then forms the basis of prospective studies. So to summarize, here what I've hoped to convey is a broad framework to think about how we can design personal screening policies by modeling impacts on individuals. And this framework is applicable with arbitrary notions of reward, meaning we can kind of plug and play our favorite notion of cost and benefits, and arbitrary risk models. So there's very similar opportunities to kind of plug and play SIBO, the lung cancer model, instead of the breast cancer model, and have a better machinery of how we design guidelines. And in doing so, we can achieve both the kind of competing aims by having better risk models and better tools to kind of use them, both better extraction and less overscreening. Now, this kind of closes this bit of the kind of what the paper does, but I want to briefly mention all the things that are missing, because this is really, I think, a direction in its infancy, and there's a huge amount of work we can really do better here. So I want to briefly kind of touch upon a couple of these things that I think are missing and really kind of exciting areas where I'm excited to build new things in before kind of opening up for questions and broader discussion. So one thing that I think is really interesting is understanding robustness to risk progression. So I mentioned here that for some risk models, they change super smoothly over time. So we can easily simulate out these kind of missing risk pieces and then fill out a simulation environment. In principle, we don't have to do that simulation. We could do it offline RL. It's harder to learn, but there's tools there. And we're not always going to have this perfect progression, and it might only hold for some subset of the population. So how do we both understand when our models are robust enough to risk progression, like what is good enough, and how do we make things that can operate in this kind of mixed environment of some risk progression and not to kind of to scale to different kinds of inputs. So that's one thing I think is going to be really interesting. The other aspect is I kind of showed selecting the screening guideline as an institution level decision. But in practice, I mean, like there are guides by like what local health systems can support, but how do you actually integrate this on a personalized treatment to individual preference and actually do meaningful preference elicitation to understand how individual patients would be best served for both their need and what they would actually like. The other aspect I think is interesting is I kind of took this dichotomy of we're just going to understand risk and we're going to design a policy. But risk in itself is a proxy. Like risk is not like, can we kind of blur this line and learn to understand the causal effect of interventions directly from the screening data itself without going through this intermediate variable of risk and directly predict the effect of interventions and learning this kind of causal effects. And I want to briefly touch on, as we think about that and kind of scale this notion beyond what is risk, that also gives us mechanism to think about hierarchical action spaces, like do you recommend MOI or not? There's a much broader space how we can rethink about policy design as kind of learning causal interventions from longitudinal screening data. Finally, I want to touch on if all this comes together and we do very well and we kind of build much better machinery to both understand patient states and design policies around it, what's the implication of this? What if we succeed? At one level, I think we have a large opportunity to rethink screening criteria and guidelines across multiple diseases, at least the ones that we already have screening, like breast cancer and lung cancer and a few others, because as we collect this rich information about patients, we should fundamentally use that to serve them better. That's not a crazy idea. The other part I think is more ambitious and also to me very exciting is if we can understand risk well enough, then we can make some diseases that can end screenable, like pancreatic cancer. Risk assessment is notoriously hard. It's not cost effective enough to screen today. So early detection next to impossible. It's even hard to develop therapeutics for early stage disease. That fundamentally comes down to a risk modeling problem. We need to build better machinery that can take more complex information to understand risk, and our policies that are going to be way more sophisticated and complicated to be able to make them cost effective. So I think it's kind of, to me, this is like a grand challenge of this kind of like risk policy design community. And finally, the better we can understand control by detection, the more doors opens up for targeted prevention and therapeutic development, the more we can kind of track this, both in terms of clinical trial design, but also better understanding where things will likely develop. And with that, I want to thank my very many collaborators through my PhD and MIT that made this possible, and the fluffiest of dogs, that is my dog. And I'm happy to kind of take questions and hopefully jump into a bigger discussion. I'll stop screen share so we can see people's faces.
Right, yeah. In fact, since this is an Affinity meeting, it's nice everybody to use their camera when it's available so we get to know each other. I have a ton of questions, but I want to open it up to the broader group to see what questions the broader group has.
I had a question about the overall model. So that you have a risk model, and then you have a separate model to predict the actions to take.
Yes.
Does the risk model, it outputs a risk score? Is that interpreted as a probability of some particular event, or is it just an overall risk score?
So the interpretation of the risk model is giving you the probability of diagnosis under an MGH-like standard of care within 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years. So that model has particular semantics, but the idea when you're learning in policy, it doesn't really care about the semantics, right? Like you could give it, you just have a set of scores that are hopefully useful for the task of cancer control and trying to learn to do something from there. So conceptually, you can put an age as a risk score, I mean, as your state space representation, which is something to kind of define what is our state.
Yeah, and so the action model isn't using the semantics of that. It's learning its own. It's learning how to deal with that in its own way.
It's learning to interpret it, which has some advantages because now let's say it has systemic miscalibration issues. Because okay, so if you think about what is risk calibration, that depends a little bit on like how you're screening today, right? Like your risk of cancer in 3 years depends on whether or not you come back in 3 years to get screened, like that. And so there's going to be kind of variable calibration issues as you switch between health systems. But the way that that risk score interacts with the actual decisions of interest, you can have observational data and learn to interpret that. So it gives you more flexibility than assuming you're going to have kind of any perfect property of the score of interest. In a way, the score itself is a proxy, right? It's a proxy of what matters. You could even skip it and go directly to the image.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Benedetta, can you introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, Adam. Nice to see you. And I would like to know why you chose in particular radiological data. You didn't consider, for example, to use resonance data or even other type of data, because you know in imaging techniques we are so full, so plenty. Why do you did you choose especially radiological data?
So in general, across different kind of disease systems, there's always a trade-off of, so we want to start with something that is widely available, kind of can capture a broad swath of the population. We're trying to do personalized screening from the general population to kind of guide people down different kinds of workflows. So in the context of breast cancer, the information that's both very widely available, but also very rich is mammography. But down the line, I don't think the final version of this model is going to look at one modality. It's going to be multimodal and be able more robust to decide, given you have different kinds of information, so we can say about your risk in kind of a unified way. Now, what happens to be very strong markers today, given our current tooling, is risk from mammography or risk from CT scans of second lung cancer. But that won't be the answer, for example, like pancreatic cancer, where we don't have this imaging. So the vision is not like imaging specific, it just sometimes imaging really is widely available and super rich.
Right. Adam, so, you know, detection is really a surrogate for survival, or not survival, for mortality. And my question really is about the depth of the data that's being used for MIRA. For example, it's not really as high a priority to detect the lesions in women that will never progress on to, you know, stage 2 or regional cancer. They stay contained. Those women survive. You can detect that cancer early or late, and those women are going to survive. But you know, hormonal markers tell us a lot about mortality. And does the large data set that you're using for MIRA include other information that you don't have in the model now? For example, hormonal status, and even mortality, you know, who lived and died?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question. So this points to like, it's kind of a universal cancer problem, right, of like understanding this holds in breast cancer, but many others, like which of these will actually be bad and like what's the impact of catching something earlier. And mortality is one way to view that, but I think like also morbidities, like the same with the neoadjuvant chemotherapy can help reduce morbidity. So there's something I spend a lot of my time now thinking about. So to answer your question directly, on working in this MGH data set, and looking at mammography specifically, we had very little of this more detailed information out available beyond just diagnosis. We found a small curated subset of it. We looked at, can you understand subtypes from the mammogram? And we found it was very hard to learn that. Unlike findings in MR, where you can kind of like better predict, you can kind of understand the subtypes a little bit from directly from MR imaging. It was very hard to get similar predictions there. When I tried to train it for some definition of more aggressive cancer, this ended up being proportional to predicting for all cancer. So meaning like a model I just trained in general for cancer diagnosis outperformed for aggressive cancer, one trying to aggressive cancer alone because it's just data set balancing. I think we'll be able to better do this when you go multimodal and you have a kind of staging of, well, give I guess to research what I'm trying to say, like I think there's two necessary innovations. One of them is innovation input space. I think in order to get this predictive capacity, we need to go beyond mammography and capture more kinds of modalities that can better inform it. We need innovations in output space. I think predicting risk, even you can say risk of invasive or risk of some bad marker is limited. We should really be predicting the benefit of intervention and how it changes outcomes. Outcomes both defined as like necessary surgery or like likely of some particular. So there's a little bit of that would change how we think about risk to more of a causal inference formulation of if I tell you come back in 6 months after I give an MRI, how likely is it to change your trajectory? I think that's the right direction to go, but it's ongoing. Yeah, it's a fantastic question.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I was wondering, so you mentioned that the risk model was looking at different things based on the time scale it was looking at. And so did you find that the features that I identified it was more about having more of a certain feature, or was it identifying different features for 1 year out versus 5 years out?
So while there was like 5 different components it could use, we found that it primarily leveraged 3 different components. Like there was basically like a lot of weights on what is the 1 year component, which is like detection, and like the 3 year head did something and the 5 year head did something. It's really hard to get deeper analysis though in terms of understanding what these components picking up. Like if we played with some like the gradient attribution based techniques, but they just like, let's imagine what matters is breast asymmetry. Either way, it highlights both breasts. Like our language, so it's really hard to kind of get that deeper notion. And even if you see a pattern you think you understand in like a couple of images who almost holds, it's very easy to kind of fall into confirmation bias. So I can confidently say it does leverage the flexibility, and if we don't use that, it hurts modeling quite a bit. And it seems to not use all of them, it uses roughly 3. But deeper than that, it's hard to get like truly meaningful insights.
You gave an example early on that showed the differences between the 2 versions of Selenia systems. And
yeah.
my thinking is that probably virtually all your data in Myra is hologic. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does one deal with that in terms of lifetime use of Myra? And hologic is very dominant in mammography, but there's many other companies, and you wouldn't want to say that you build a policy around an AI algorithm that only works on hologic systems, for example. So what would be the there's 2 routes. One would be what would be the extension to allow the system to be generalized into other make and models, but more importantly, how do you verify long term that the algorithm is going to be stable from a quality control perspective, that small changes that happen in the technology don't just break Myra, or at least affect its sensitivity specificity?
Yeah. So we have I didn't show you in the talk, we have tested it in other devices recently. So we had a validation set from Brazil that was only GE. It actually maintains performance there as well. We don't know, and we couldn't check, is if it's calibrated the same way as it is for hologic. So we haven't had a mixed data set of both yet. And our colleagues in KP also saw that performance seems to be relative between Mira and hologic, but does not say for all devices in the future, right? Like, and we don't know for the long tail possible devices.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I think it remains an open question of what is the performance characteristic across the long tail devices, and like how do we get there? I think as we get more modalities represented, you will likely get better zero-shot transfer between them, or at least ability to kind of say, hey, you also want like a learn to abstain feature, right? Like hey, my calibration here seems off. I can't expect what's going on there. There's some promising techniques I've seen recently in like the CVPR community. So like Alicia Efros has some really interesting work on test time training, where the broad prediction, like you have these like self-supervised models that kind of like learn part of the representation by predicting missing components of the original image. Mm-hmm. And when that error goes higher, you can imagine this is a kind of proxy score to understand when you're out of distribution. There's some work kind of exploring on that vein. So I think there's both improvements to better understand when are you out of distribution to flag out where is the next necessary technology investment is going to be. Long-term monitoring, I think it's a fascinating question. We have it in many places, like including regular sepsis prediction. And I think the way to I think there's a kind of co-design between how you frame the model and how modelable is it, right? Let's imagine we have like great risk-based interventions, and we have strong models to predict 5-year risk. Well, if we make good risk interventions, then everyone's going to get caught earlier, and the calibration is going to look way up, right? Like, so we need, if we instead of the model, it's not predicting risk, it's predicting the impact of interventions. Then we can monitor that. We're going to say, well, how is the interventions behaving? And does it behave as we expect? Even if the capacity is proportional to risk. I think this is something I expect to happen across many domains at the same time, and this is something I'm like very much working on now, is reformulating the question in a way that's more monitorable. Because you can't just wait 5 years to see the model go astray, right?
Right.
But the interventions aren't 5 years away either. The interventions are like now. So I think there's a little bit of a missing gap there, and I think that's going to take better question formulation.
So UPenn has years ago they came up with a physical phantom for doing drug trial monitoring, and then they created a software version of that phantom. It's Andrew Maymont did that, and I don't remember the name of the phantom, but it's it's effectively just it's just synthetic data, right? So could there be an approach where you use synthetic data where that's being acquired on the systems over time, or even a physical phantom that's being acquired over time, that would just monitor key features in the latent space to know that, you know, there's not a big change going on in the model, that so you can predict it up front before you start seeing outcome changes, or prediction changes.
I think that'd be really interesting. So I think the limitation of phantom-based approaches is basically coverage, right? Like, so it's there's like two types of approaches. One of them is you take your just population assets coming in, and just from test client inputs, what kind of changes can you detect?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's harder to power that. You need to, because it's not the same patients over time. But it's doable. The alternative, which is easier to learn, is you have the exact same objects, just like different machinery across the line. Is it changing in the way the chain is the overall prediction?
Right.
But then it's hard to have a fully representative version of that captures all the patterns that will occur. So some mixed strategy is probably necessary. And I think it's broadly an open challenge. We found that like we try to do like prediction drift over time, but imaging machines tend to change so slowly that it's hard to it's hard to have a meaning. Like you kind of want a benchmark of, here are a bunch of changes of throw off model predictions. Can you have cop them? And our current learn model robustness benchmarks in the ML community are like blurring on MNIST or blurring on ImageNet, which is super like not representative of the kind of changes we expect. So I think there's a level of like, we need better benchmarks to like characterize this issue and actually make better solutions. I haven't found one yet, but this is fascinating.
Well, but companies are getting their algorithms FDA approved. And do you have any feel for how the FDA has been approaching this question of long-term stability in AI algorithms for medical imaging?
So I actually had a very long conversation with someone from the FDA 2 weeks ago at a conference discussing exactly this. And my impression is it did not get it at all. And I hope they got up at the end of the conversation.
So
but like,
you don't think
their philosophy?
You don't think they're
100%
alert to the problem yet? Is what you're saying?
No. Because it's not like drugs. Where drugs, if like biology is not changing over time dramatically, right? So if the drug, basically their view is, we will approve you for where you ran your trial. We will approve you for the restricted indication where you showed me effect.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not make you safe when the technology that you're relying on is changing.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a very, very long time for this point to get across in this conversation. I don't think that perspective is common in the FDA today, and I don't think the current regulatory measures in any way capture it. It's also an open problem. Like, it's not like we can point them to an existing solution. Even like widely used tools like sepsis management in hospitals are probably like the most widely deployed class of AI tools in health systems. Like every time I speak to people at UCSF, speaking to people at Stanford, like I don't think there's the best practice of how to monitor in the long term where the nature of the data is changing is very much unsolved. And the FDA both doesn't, in my experience, doesn't recognize the problem and doesn't know what they would do if they did. So we have some work to do.
Yeah, usually it pops up to where the some huge problem happens because, you know, an algorithm goes out of calibration on a big medical, infrastructure and causes something horrible to happen, right? And then the FDA just clamps down, and that would be nice to avoid, right?
Exactly, I agree. It's like I said, there's some serious work to do.
Okay, what other questions do we have?
Speaking of meaningful features, if you're looking at the Mirai results that you trained using your Hologic data, it was like 0.76 AUC, right? And then the Brazilian data was like 0.82, I think.
Yeah.
Was that GE? And did you look at any special features as why that came out so high?
So it's actually not GE. It's more of it's a quirk of the screening system. So if you have a place that has less screening, and where screening is generally called a bit later, then what looks like 5-year risk in one might be really 2-year risk in the other, and it actually will inflate your numbers. So in a way, like the better the detection in the system, the better it is actually a place to train, because then you'll have a cleaner gauge of the signal. And if you have places where it's screened less often and cancers are going to be in general caught larger, then your risk numbers will go higher because more of that component can get caught earlier. So in general, we find that places with less frequent screening had higher AUCs. The calibration is also different because it's just like what risk is really a malformed notion, because probability of cancer diagnosis clearly depends on the next time you get screened and how you get screened and like what screening operating point you're taking on. And we're really learning this in one place, or a particular standard of care, but you'd really rather be learning, given this patient and then the next possible screen, what's the likely outcome? Because that will more condition on that. Then you can start asking counterfactual questions. So I think really viewing it like that ties together both policy design and this kind of learning problem. It's harder to do things this way. Like there's lots of more complications that pop up. But I think that's the right way to view the problem and where I'm trying to drive next.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Who else do we have? It's an excellent opportunity that Adam's sitting here and answer. Okay, go ahead, Adriana.
I have a question about your reinforcement learning problem that you have set up. So is the hypothesis that there's an optimal pair of lambdas for benefit and cost for the entire population?
So not exactly. So I view lambda as a test time parameter. Like for example, like different groups. So we've got like a lambda to me is an input because there's always going to be a cost and benefits any screening action. And the right way to choose a trade-off is fundamentally like an individual system-wide decision. Like the national health systems and across Europe have taken different points of like what they think is justified cost benefits in screening than some different associations in the US. There's no right answer there, but I don't want to enforce one as a model designer. I want to expose the various options and just like for whatever you believe is the right objective, let me help you best achieve that objective via better tooling. And I think that will always hold. And most of decision making like this, right? There's always trade-offs. And I think sometimes in the older modeling literature, it's like we're going to simulate annual biennial screening and like a 40,000 hypothetical population. Here's the right cost-effective trade-off. But I don't philosophically disagree with this kind of approach because if anyone's decision, I definitely don't want it to be me.
So when you're running the Q-learning simulation or whatever type of RL that you're using, do you vary the lambdas throughout, or do you at each time step, do you try a bunch of different lambda combinations, or how exactly does that work?
So I have a slide for this. So give me 1 second. I'll pull up the slide.
Yeah.
That is a good question. Give me 1 second. Let me, there we go. Okay, cool. So I'll just pull this up real quick. So this problem is called broadly multiple objective reinforcement learning. So there's kind of a family of techniques. Let me first go through like the toy solution, which doesn't really work, and then like through the actual thing that we do. So the toy solution of multiple objective Q learning is you just expand your Q functions. Instead of having just state action, it's state action lambda. Now your reward is just lambda times the reward vector times the lambda weighted output vector, right? So this is, and you're basically plugging in lambda as a parameter. Now you're just sampling a new lambda for every step, and you just train accordingly. So you're just always changing lambda as you go along by training. The issue with this approach is that like lambdas are really inherently related, right? There's like structure in this process, like two lambdas that are like epsilon away from each other will have very similar perfect like rewards overall. So by not leveraging that, you kind of lose an opportunity to improve your learning efficiency. So we actually use something called on-envelope Q learning. And the basic idea here is, so all Q learning is bootstrapping, right? Like if I have a state and an action that should be related to the best action for the next expected states, and you're bootstrapping that information, you can do very similar bootstrapping off of lambdas. So if for my preference, let's say imagine my preference is this line over here, and I'm predicting that my expected value is going to be this green dot. But if I could take a separate lambda and get back this pink dot or this blue dot, then that will be better for the lambda that I care about. So you can kind of bootstrap from other preferences. And what that looks like as a learning rule is when you look at like the best action, you're actually looking at both the best action and the best possible lambda for the lambda you actually care about to kind of transfer the knowledge back. And this actually ends up being much more efficient. So like the similar kind of like Q learning ideas of bootstrapping from other knowledge is very similar here when you scale across preferences. So it's actually very efficient. It works surprisingly well.
Makes sense. Interesting. Any other questions? I know we're up at the hour here. Okay, well, thank you so much, Adam. This was a very interesting talk, and we will contact
welcome.
you soon about the beer stein.
Okay, I'm excited. Thank you.
Thanks
everyone.
so much.